The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones even when you wore layers of wool and heavy coats. It was 1939, and across Europe a silence was spreading. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm. People felt it in the air, in the way neighbors stopped talking openly in the streets, in the way radios carried speeches filled with fire and menace, in the way governments whispered of alliances and enemies. There was fear, but there was also a sense of inevitability, as though the world was about to tip into something no one could control. I remember the sound of footsteps on cobblestones in Warsaw, the hurried rhythm of people trying to get home before curfew. Shops were half empty, food lines longer than they had been months before, and in every corner of the city, soldiers' uniforms began to appear more frequently. Poland was trapped between powerful nations, caught like a bird in the jaws of two beasts. On one side, Germany grew louder with every speech Hitler delivered. On the other, the Soviet Union loomed, quiet but calculating. People knew, though they could not say it aloud, that war was not just coming, it was already here. A young boy stood with his father outside a bakery, clutching a loaf of bread as though it were gold. He did not yet understand that soon bread would be rarer than money. His father kept glancing down the street, watching soldiers march past, their boots slamming the ground in perfect unison. It was a sound that echoed deep inside the chest, a sound of discipline, power, and threat. The boy asked his father why the soldiers looked so serious. The father answered with words the boy could not forget, because they believe the world belongs to them. News traveled slowly then, but rumors traveled fast. There were whispers of Germany preparing to invade, whispers of tanks hidden near the border, of planes filling the skies at dawn. People dismissed it, until the morning of September 1st, when the sky itself seemed to split apart with the roar of engines. Bombs fell on Warsaw with such force that the earth shook. Windows shattered, dust and smoke filled the air, and families scrambled into basements, holding onto each other as the world above collapsed. Those who survived the first wave of bombing came out to see a city scarred and burning. A tram lay overturned in the street, its metal twisted like paper. Horses that had pulled carts only hours before now lay lifeless, and men tried to clear the rubble with their bare hands to find children trapped underneath. The war had arrived not with a declaration, but with fire. I still remember the face of a mother screaming her child's name, running barefoot over broken glass, her hair tangled with dust and ash. Soldiers tried to keep order, but there was no order left. The city was drowning in chaos. German troops pushed in quickly, their tanks rolling across bridges, their planes circling overhead. Within weeks, the city that had once been full of music, markets, and chatter became a place of whispers, ration cards, and fear. But Poland was not alone. Across Europe, nations were awakening to the realization that Hitler's promises had been lies, that his hunger for land and power would not stop at one border. In Britain, families huddled around radios, listening to Prime Minister Chamberlain's voice tremble as he announced that the country was now at war with Germany. The words fell heavy, not just as political speech, but as a sentence passed down upon millions of ordinary lives. In France, soldiers marched to the front, but their faces were pale with uncertainty. They remembered the Great War, the trenches, the gas, the endless slaughter. Many of them feared this would be worse. And in Germany, not everyone cheered for Hitler's victories. There were mothers who wept as their sons were conscripted, fathers who feared the letters that would one day arrive with black seals. The propaganda painted pictures of glory, but in the hearts of many there was dread. Across the Atlantic in the United States, people watched from afar. Newspapers carried headlines of invasion, of cities falling, of governments collapsing. But America was weary of war. The wounds of the Great War had not yet healed, and many believed that oceans would keep them safe. Yet there were voices, journalists, leaders, and immigrants who had fled Europe, who warned that this was not a war that could be ignored. They spoke of a darkness spreading, a darkness that, if left unchecked, would one day touch every shore. In the months that followed, the map of Europe changed with frightening speed. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, each fell like dominoes as the German war machine advanced. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ruins in days. Families became refugees overnight, carrying only what they could in small bundles, leaving behind homes, memories, graves. Train stations overflowed with desperate crowds, children clinging to their mothers' skirts, old men struggling to keep pace. Yet amidst this terror, there were also sparks of defiance. Resistance groups began to form in secret, passing messages written in code, hiding weapons in barns, sheltering those who were hunted. In villages, ordinary farmers risked everything to smuggle children across borders. Priests opened church basements to the persecuted, and though the German armies seemed unstoppable, these small acts of courage whispered a truth the Nazis could never silence. People would not surrender their humanity so easily. The storm was only beginning, but already the world was being reshaped. Borders were erased, cities destroyed, families torn apart. And in the shadows of this destruction, an even darker reality was being built. Camps where human lives were reduced to numbers, where cruelty was perfected into machinery. Few yet knew the scale of what was coming, but the seeds had already been planted. And so the world stood at the edge of something vast and terrible. Some hoped it would end quickly, that sanity would prevail, but most sensed in their bones that this was only the beginning of a war unlike any the world had ever seen. The winter of 1940 settled over Europe like a heavy shroud. The war had been raging for months, and already the balance of power seemed to tip toward Germany. Across the occupied nation, silence fell under the boots of soldiers. Streets that once echoed with laughter, now echoed with commands barked in a foreign tongue. Posters were plastered on walls, written in German, telling people what they could and could not do. Radios no longer played what they once did. The world people knew had been replaced by something harder, colder, crueler. In Paris, a city of lights now dimmed. Cafe owners shuttered their doors early. People walked quickly, not daring to linger in groups for fear of being accused of conspiracy. The German flag hung from buildings where French banners once flew, and soldiers drank wine at tables where poets and painters had once debated art and philosophy. The contrast was painful. For those who loved the city, seeing it in chains was like seeing a loved one struck down. Yet life continued because it had to. Mothers still needed to feed their children, fathers still searched for work, and young lovers still stole glances in the shadows, as though hope could survive even in the darkest corners. Far to the east, in the Soviet Union, another story was unfolding. Stalin had signed his pact with Hitler, carving Poland into pieces, and many believed this uneasy alliance would hold. But beneath the surface, mistrust was brewing. Soviet soldiers guarded their half of Poland with suspicion, treating its people as though they were enemies in their own homes. Families who had lived for generations in small towns suddenly found themselves under new rulers, their traditions questioned, their loyalties doubted. And in Britain, the war took on a new face. After the fall of France, Britain stood alone against the Nazi Empire. It was a small island against a continent now in enemy hands. But it did not bow. Winston Churchill had risen to lead, and his words carried fire. He told his people that they would fight on the beaches, on the fields, in the streets, that they would never surrender. His speeches were more than words. They were lifelines. They gave strength to a nation battered by fear, strength to ordinary men and women who knew that at any moment the bombs might fall upon them. And fall they did. The summer of 1940 brought the Blitz. Night after night, London and other British cities were hammered by German planes. The sound of sirens wailed through the streets, and people rushed into underground shelters, clutching whatever they could. The ground shook as bombs tore apart buildings, fires roared, glass shattered. Families huddled together on cold concrete floors, whispering prayers in the darkness as above them their homes burned. But the people did not break. Even as smoke filled the skies, even as rubble replaced familiar streets, Londoners emerged each morning, brushed off the dust, and carried on. Milkmen delivered bottles to doorsteps, sometimes setting them carefully on piles of rubble where a house had stood the day before. Children played in the ruins, their laughter defiant against the destruction. The resilience was almost unimaginable, yet it was real. Pilots of the Royal Air Force, many barely out of their teenage years, soared into the skies to meet the German Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain was fought not in trenches but in the clouds, with roaring engines and trails of smoke marking the deadly duels. Dogfights unfolded above villages, while farmers and townsfolk looked up, watching with awe and dread. The survival of Britain hung by a thread, and that thread was held by the courage of those young men. Some never returned, their planes crashing into fields or seas, but their sacrifice kept the invasion at bay. Across the Atlantic, America still held back. President Roosevelt watched carefully, balancing the cries of those who demanded neutrality with the pleas of those who urged action. He spoke of lending a hand to those who fought tyranny, of being the arsenal of democracy. Ships crossed the ocean carrying supplies, food, weapons, tanks, sent to Britain to keep the fight alive. But many Americans still believed the war was not theirs to fight. The pain of the Great War still lingered, and the graves of the fallen still weighed heavy. Yet Roosevelt sensed what others did not want to admit, that if Hitler conquered all of Europe, if Britain fell, then America's oceans would no longer protect it. He chose his words carefully, but they carried a warning. History was shifting, and America could not stand apart forever. Meanwhile, in the occupied lands, shadows deepened. In villages across Poland and Czechoslovakia, new orders were issued. Jews were to register, to wear armbands with yellow stars. At first, many believed it was only another humiliation, another cruel law. But as time passed, the reality grew darker. Businesses were confiscated, synagogues burned, and families forced into ghettos surrounded by walls and guards. The ghettos were crowded, disease spread, and hunger gnawed at everyone. Still, people tried to live. Children studied secretly, musicians played in basements, families lit candles in hidden corners. Life clung on, fragile but unbroken. Not all looked away. In secret, underground newspapers spread the truth. Resistance fighters smuggled weapons, and couriers carried messages to London. But the risks were immense. A single mistake could mean execution, not just for one person, but for entire families. Yet still the resistance grew, because hope, once planted, could not be stamped out so easily. The war was no longer just about territory. It was becoming a battle over humanity itself. Every act of kindness, every word of defiance, every refusal to surrender one's dignity was a strike against tyranny. And though the war stretched across continents, from the burning skies of London to the frozen forests of Eastern Europe, one thing united the people: the knowledge that this fight was not just for survival, but for the soul of the world itself. The year was 1941, and the war was spreading like wildfire across the globe. What had once seemed a European conflict was now turning into something far larger, something that threatened to engulf every nation. The Nazi Empire stretched across vast territories, from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow. But even that was not enough for Hitler. His ambition, like a fire that consumed everything in its path, demanded more. In June of that year, Germany broke its pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Millions of German soldiers, along with their allies, poured across the border into Soviet lands. Tanks rolled over endless fields, planes roared above, and artillery thundered day and night. The Soviets were taken by surprise, their defenses collapsing under the sheer weight of the assault. Towns were swallowed whole, villages burned, and soldiers found themselves retreating faster than they could regroup. For those who lived in the path of the invasion, life turned into a nightmare. Families fled eastward, carrying what little they could. Carts creaked under the weight of belongings. Mothers held children close. Old men stumbled on roads filled with dust and fear. Behind them, the smoke of their homes rose into the sky. German troops advanced relentlessly, and with them came a new kind of terror. Orders were given to show no mercy, to treat the people not as human beings, but as obstacles to be cleared. Entire communities vanished in days. But the Soviet Union was vast, and its people were fierce. In cities like Leningrad, the siege began. German forces surrounded the city, cutting off supplies. For months, then years, the people endured hunger so severe that bread was worth more than gold. Families boiled leather belts to make soup. Children searched for crumbs in the snow, and thousands perished each winter. Yet the city did not surrender. Through unimaginable suffering, the people of Leningrad held on, their defiance becoming a symbol to the world. In Moscow, panic spread as the German army drew near. The capital itself seemed within reach of Hitler's grasp. But in the depths of winter, the Soviet counterattack came. Reinforcements poured in. Soldiers wrapped in fur against the brutal cold, determined to defend their land at any cost. The fighting was merciless, the losses staggering, but slowly the tide began to turn. For the first time, the German war machine faced the possibility of defeat. While Europe was consumed by flames, far away across the Pacific, another storm was gathering. Japan, already at war in China, looked hungrily toward new territories. Resources were scarce, and expansion seemed the only path forward. Negotiations with the United States faltered, and Japanese leaders chose a path of aggression. Their target was Pearl Harbor, a name that would soon be etched into history forever. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the skies above Hawaii filled with the roar of aircraft. Japanese planes swooped down, unleashing bombs and torpedoes upon the unsuspecting fleet. Battleships burned, planes exploded on the runways, and sailors scrambled for cover as chaos erupted. The attack lasted barely 2 hours, but its impact shook the world. Thousands were killed or wounded, and the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. In the United States, shock turned to fury. President Roosevelt addressed the nation, his voice steady yet filled with fire. He called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The next day, America declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America in return. The conflict was no longer confined to Europe or Asia. The Second World War had become truly global. For American families, the war that had once seemed far away was now at their doorstep. Sons left farms, factories, and schools to wear uniforms. Daughters rolled bandages, built airplanes, and worked in shipyards. Factories that once produced cars now churned out tanks. The entire nation transformed itself into a machine of war. Posters urged people to save scrap metal, to buy war bonds, to plant victory gardens. Sacrifice became a way of life. On the front lines, American soldiers soon found themselves fighting in lands they had only read about in newspapers. In North Africa, they battled under scorching suns, tanks clashing across desert sands. In the Pacific, Marines waded ashore on islands where every palm tree could hide an enemy. The war was brutal, the conditions harsh, but there was a growing sense of unity. Americans alongside their allies were now part of a struggle that would decide the future of the world. And yet, in the shadows of all this, darker truths grew clearer. Reports began to emerge of camps in Poland and elsewhere, camps where people disappeared and never returned. At first, many dismissed them as rumors. The scale of such cruelty seemed impossible to believe. But as the war went on, more and more evidence surfaced. Refugees spoke of ghettos emptied overnight, of trains that left but never came back. The world was only beginning to grasp the true horror, a horror beyond battlefields, beyond even the bombs and guns. By the end of 1941, the war had become a storm unlike any in history. From the deserts of Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia, from the burning skies of London to the shattered harbors of Hawaii, humanity was locked in a struggle for survival. The outcome was uncertain, the cost unimaginable. But one thing was clear. The fight was no longer about borders or politics. It was about the future of civilization itself. For the year was 1942, and the war had entered a new and even more brutal phase. With America now fully engaged, the conflict stretched across every corner of the globe. Battles raged in deserts, jungles, oceans, and skies. Each front demanded sacrifices, and each victory was paid for in blood. In North Africa, the heat was merciless. Sandstorms swept across the horizon, blinding soldiers and clogging engines. The desert seemed endless, and yet it became the stage for some of the fiercest battles of the war. German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, led his Africa Corps with deadly skill, striking fast and retreating just as quickly. Against him, British forces, soon joined by American troops, struggled to hold the line. Tanks clashed on open dunes, shells bursting like thunder across the barren land. To the men who fought there, survival depended not only on courage, but on water, shade, and the hope that reinforcements would arrive in time. Back in Europe, resistance movements grew stronger. In occupied France, Small groups of men and women met in cellars and barns, whispering plans by candlelight. They forged false papers, blew up train tracks, and passed secret messages to Allied agents. Each act carried enormous risk. A single betrayal could lead to torture or death. Yet they persisted, driven by the belief that freedom, though distant, was worth any price. Some of them were barely more than children, but their defiance struck fear into the occupiers, showing that even the most powerful armies could not crush the human spirit. Far to the east, the battle for Stalingrad began. The city on the banks of the Volga River became the focus of Hitler's ambition and Stalin's determination. What unfolded there was not just a battle, but a nightmare. German planes reduced entire districts to rubble, yet the Soviets refused to abandon the city. Soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor, in a struggle so close that at times enemies could hear each other breathing through thin walls. Streets were littered with corpses, rivers ran red, and winter's icy grip froze the wounded where they lay. For months, the two armies bled each other dry, but in the end, it was the Soviets who encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting off their supplies. Hungry, exhausted, and trapped, tens of thousands of German soldiers surrendered in early 1943. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the war took on its own savage rhythm. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia, capturing vast territories. But at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the tide began to turn. American codebreakers discovered the Japanese plans, and the U.S. Navy prepared an ambush. The battle raged across the ocean, aircraft carriers launching wave after wave of planes. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, crippling Japan's naval strength. For the first time, America had struck a decisive blow, proving that the war in the Pacific would not be won so easily by the empire of the rising sun. On the home front, life in America changed dramatically. Ration books determined how much sugar, meat, and gasoline a family could have. Posters urged women to join the workforce, and millions responded. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength as women built planes, ships, and weapons. Children collected scrap metal, families planted gardens, and communities held drives to support the troops overseas. Every citizen was told they had a role in the war effort, and most embraced it with determination. But even as the war effort united people, it also revealed deep injustices. In the United States, Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, their loyalty questioned simply because of their heritage. Families lost their homes, businesses, and freedom, locked behind barbed wire in the name of national security. Many of their sons, however, volunteered to fight for the very country that had imprisoned their families, forming one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. Their courage stood as a testament to the complexity of loyalty and sacrifice in a time of fear. Elsewhere, the shadow of the Holocaust grew darker. In ghettos across Eastern Europe, the walls closed in tighter. Deportations increased, trains carrying thousands to places whispered about but rarely understood. Names like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor began to spread in hushed tones, places where people disappeared without trace. In reality, these were not just camps. They were factories of death. Inside their gates, men, women, and children were stripped of their names, their belongings, their dignity, and finally their lives. Smoke rose from chimneys day and night, and the silence of the murdered hung heavy over the land. At first, the world outside knew little of the scale of this horror. But reports trickled out through the resistance, through escaped prisoners, through whispers carried across borders. Though some doubted, others began to realize the truth. This was not just a war of conquest, but a war against entire peoples. The Nazi vision was one of extermination, and it had to be stopped at any cost. By the end of 1942, the tide of war had begun to shift. Victories at Stalingrad and Midway proved that the Axis could be beaten. But the cost was staggering, and the road ahead remained long. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions had died, and the darkest chapters of human cruelty were still unfolding. The world was locked in a struggle where the stakes were nothing less than survival itself. And yet, in the midst of this destruction, hope endured. Hope in the resilience of those who fought in the ruins of Stalingrad. Hope in the sailors who faced the vast Pacific. Hope in the families who rationed and sacrificed. Hope in the resistance fighters who risked everything for freedom. The war was far from over, but humanity's will to fight, to endure, and to believe in a better future burned brighter than ever. The year was 1943, and the world was beginning to change. After years of defeats and despair, the Allies finally felt the tide shifting in their favor. It was not yet victory, but it was momentum, and momentum in war could mean everything. In North Africa, the Desert War came to an end. British and American forces, after months of grueling battles, finally pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps back. At El Alamein, the Allies had struck a decisive blow, and with Operation Torch, American troops had landed in Morocco and Algeria. Together, they squeezed the Axis forces between them until there was no escape. In May 1943, the last German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The desert fell silent, and for the first time, the Allies had forced the Axis into retreat. From the sands of Africa, the fight moved to the mountains of Italy. The Allies launched an invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Fierce battles raged across villages and hillsides, as soldiers fought through narrow streets and olive groves. The land was beautiful but unforgiving, and every mile was bought with blood. Yet the campaign brought unexpected consequences. Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, was overthrown by his own people. The fascist regime crumbled, and Italy switched sides, though the Germans quickly moved in to keep fighting alive. The war in Italy would drag on for years, but for the Allies, it marked another turning point. The Axis was not invincible. Meanwhile, across the vast Eastern Front, the greatest tank battle in history was about to unfold. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, German and Soviet armies clashed in a thunderous confrontation. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of guns, and millions of men collided in a battle that stretched for weeks. The ground shook under the weight of steel, the skies filled with smoke, and the fields were littered with wrecks. When it was over, the Germans were broken. Their last great offensive in the east had failed, and the Soviets began their relentless march westward. From that moment, the Red Army would not stop until Berlin itself lay in ruins. Back in the Atlantic, another struggle raged. German U-boats prowled the seas, sinking ships that carried vital supplies to Britain and Russia. Merchant sailors risked their lives on every voyage, knowing a single torpedo could end it all. Convoys traveled under constant threat, their decks cold with salt spray and fear. But new technology, radar, sonar, and long-range aircraft, turned the tide. Slowly, the hunters became the hunted, and the wolf packs that once terrorized the oceans began to dwindle. The lifeline across the Atlantic was secured, and with it the strength of the Allied war machine. For the people living under occupation, 1943 was a year of both despair and courage. In Warsaw, whispers of rebellion spread through the ghettos. The Nazis continued their deportations, sending thousands each week to camps from which none returned. But in April, the Jewish resistance rose. With homemade weapons, stolen guns, and sheer determination, they fought back. For nearly a month, they held the Germans at bay, street by street, bunker by bunker. The outcome was never in doubt. The resistance was hopelessly outnumbered. But their defiance became a symbol of courage against impossible odds. The city burned, but their spirit did not. In the skies, the war became more destructive than ever. American bombers flew in massive formations over Germany, their targets factories, railways, and cities. The raids were deadly, both for those on the ground and for the crews who faced relentless flak and fighter attacks. Entire squadrons were sometimes lost in a single mission, but the bombers kept coming day after day, night after night, determined to break the Nazi war machine. The destruction was immense, but so too was the sacrifice. Young men who had once dreamed of futures as farmers, teachers, or fathers now gave their lives in the cold skies over Europe. On the home fronts across the world, sacrifices deepened. In Britain, rationing grew stricter, and families tightened their belts. In America, war production reached levels once thought impossible. Ships rolled off assembly lines in days, planes in hours. Women continued to fill roles once reserved for men, proving themselves indispensable. In the Soviet Union, the cost was beyond comprehension. Cities still lay in ruins, Millions were dead, yet the people pressed on with unbreakable resolve. Every village, every factory, every child knew they were part of a struggle for survival itself. By the end of 1943, the shape of the war had changed. The Axis still held vast territories, but their strength was faltering. The Allies had reclaimed North Africa, invaded Italy, crushed the German offensive at Kursk, and turned the tide in the Atlantic. Everywhere the signs pointed to a long and bloody road ahead, but also to a future where victory was possible. And through it all, when truth became clear, this war was not just being fought by armies and generals. It was being fought by everyone. By the soldier charging across a battlefield, by the pilot braving flak in the skies, by the mother who rationed food, by the child who gathered scraps for recycling, by the prisoner who resisted with his last breath. The war consumed the world, but it was carried forward by millions of individuals, each playing their part in history's greatest struggle. The year was 1944, and the war had reached a critical moment. The Allies were preparing for the greatest gamble of the entire conflict, the liberation of Western Europe. For years, Hitler's armies had occupied the continent, fortifying its coasts, building walls of steel and concrete. Yet the Allies knew that if they were to end the war, they had to strike back across the English Channel. The invasion would be vast, dangerous, and uncertain, but it was the only way forward. In the months leading up to the assault, southern England became a sea of men, machines, and determination. Camps filled with American, British, Canadian, and soldiers from nations in exile. Fields turned into airstrips. Ports overflowed with ships, and secret plans were drawn in guarded rooms. Generals debated, argued, and calculated every risk, knowing that failure could prolong the war for years. June 6, 1944, dawned under a heavy sky. In the early hours of the morning, thousands of paratroopers leapt into the darkness over Normandy, drifting through flak and gunfire, landing in fields and hedgerows. Many were scattered, lost, or killed before they could regroup. But those who survived began their work, cutting German communications, seizing bridges, and sowing chaos behind enemy lines. At dawn, the greatest armada in history appeared on the horizon. Thousands of ships carried men, tanks, and supplies across the channel. On the beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the fate of Europe hung in the balance. As the landing craft opened, soldiers rushed forward into a storm of bullets, shells, and obstacles. The water turned red, the air filled with smoke and screams, yet still they pressed on. At Omaha Beach, the slaughter was almost unbearable. Entire units were cut down before they even reached the shore. But slowly, inch by inch, the Allies carved out a foothold. By nightfall, the beachheads were secure, and the liberation of France had begun. Behind the lines, French resistance fighters rose in coordination with the landings. They cut railway lines, ambushed convoys, and guided Allied troops through hidden paths. Their years of suffering and sacrifice now bore fruit, as ordinary citizens struck back against the occupiers. Every act, no matter how small, brought the dream of freedom closer. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, one of the largest offensives in history. In June 1944, waves of Soviet armies smashed through German lines in Belarus, overwhelming the Wehrmacht. Cities fell, German divisions were annihilated, and the Red Army surged forward with unstoppable momentum. By the end of summer, the Germans had lost hundreds of thousands of men, and the Eastern Front had collapsed. In Italy, the Allies fought bitterly up the peninsula. The battle for Monte Cassino dragged on for months, the ancient monastery reduced to rubble by relentless bombardment. The Germans defended every hill, every river, forcing the Allies to pay dearly for each advance. Rome was finally liberated in June, but the fighting in Italy would continue until the very end of the war. As the Allies closed in from east and west, the Nazi regime grew ever more desperate. Hitler refused to consider retreat or surrender. He demanded his armies fight to the last man, regardless of the cost. Cities were fortified, civilians pressed into service, and fear ruled in the streets. Yet cracks began to show even within Germany itself. July 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb in his headquarters. The plan failed. and those involved were executed. But it revealed that even inside the heart of the regime, resistance still flickered. On the home front, the war reached new intensity. In Britain, the German V-1 buzz bombs rained down on London, bringing terror from the skies. Families listened for the dreadful drone of the engines, knowing that when the sound stopped, the bomb would fall. In America, factories worked day and night, turning out planes, tanks, and ammunition in staggering numbers. Soldiers left their homes in waves, knowing the final battles lay ahead. By the end of 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, cheering, crying, embracing the soldiers who had freed them. The bells of Notre Dame rang out, and for the first time in years, the City of Light was truly free. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the war was far from over. Germany still held strong, and Hitler prepared for one last desperate strike in the West. In December, the Ardennes forest became the stage for the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing cold, German tanks and troops surged forward in a surprise attack, tearing into American lines. Snow fell thick, visibility was low, and the situation grew dire. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of stubborn resistance, as surrounded soldiers refused to surrender, despite overwhelming odds. Supplies ran low, frostbite set in, but the lines held. With reinforcements, the Allies pushed back, and the last German offensive in the West was broken. By the close of 1944, the end of the war was within sight, but the cost was unimaginable. Millions more had died, cities were destroyed, and families torn apart. Yet hope burned brighter than ever. The Allies now stood on the threshold of victory, preparing for the final push into Germany itself. The world had endured years of darkness, but the dawn was coming. The year was 1945, and the world stood at the edge of both victory and catastrophe. The war had raged for more than 5 years, leaving behind a trail of ruin unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. Millions were dead, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered forever. Yet, even as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the fight grew more savage, more desperate, as if the Nazi regime intended to drag the world into the abyss with it. In January, the Soviet Union launched its final great offensive. From the east, waves of Red Army soldiers surged across frozen rivers and snowy fields, smashing through the last German defenses. Town after town fell, the German army retreating but never surrendering. Civilians fled westward in endless columns, terrified of what awaited them. Berlin, once the proud capital of the Reich, trembled as the sound of artillery drew ever closer. Meanwhile, from the west, American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine River. The once mighty German fortifications crumbled before their advance. Bridges were seized in daring raids, supply lines stretched deep into the heart of Germany, and villages that had lived under Nazi rule for years finally saw liberation. But the joy of freedom was tempered by the sight of devastation and by the horrors that the Allies began to uncover. In the spring of 1945, Allied soldiers stumbled upon the concentration camps, places like Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. What they found there defied belief. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, their eyes hollow, their bodies broken, barely clinging to life. Piles of corpses, gas chambers, ovens. The full scale of the Holocaust began to reveal itself. 6 million Jews had been murdered, alongside millions of others. Prisoners of war, political dissidents, Roma, the disabled, and countless innocents. The camps were not just evidence of war. They were evidence of systematic evil. Soldiers who had fought through the bloodiest battles stood in silence, unable to comprehend the cruelty before them. The war was about liberation, but now it was also about bearing witness. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, Hitler refused to yield. In his underground bunker, he raged against betrayal, issuing impossible orders to armies that no longer existed. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life, ending his rule in a self-inflicted silence. Days later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Across Europe, church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, and tears of relief fell freely. After years of suffering, the war in Europe was finally over, yet peace was still far away. In the Pacific, the war raged on. Japan, though battered and isolated, refused to surrender. Fierce battles unfolded on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. American soldiers fought yard by yard against defenders who preferred death to defeat. Kamikaze pilots turned their planes into weapons, crashing into ships in desperate final acts. The cost was staggering, the casualties immense. Leaders feared that an invasion of Japan itself would bring casualties in the millions. As summer approached, a new and terrible weapon was prepared in secret. Born from years of scientific research under the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb promised destruction beyond imagination. In August 1945, the world saw its power unleashed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reduced to ash in moments. Their skies turned into fire, their streets into shadows. Tens of thousands died instantly, and many more in the days that followed. The world entered the atomic age with a shudder. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The emperor's voice, broadcast over the radio, spoke of enduring the unbearable for the sake of peace. After 6 years, the deadliest war in human history had finally ended. Scene 9, finale. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of war lingered everywhere. The world looked upon the ruins and counted its dead. More than 60 million lives lost, cities leveled, generations scarred. Families searched for loved ones who would never return. Survivors carried memories too heavy to speak aloud. For some, liberation brought joy. For others, it revealed grief beyond words. In Europe, displaced persons wandered roads with nowhere to go. Children orphaned by war clutched at strangers' hands. Soldiers returned home to find their towns destroyed, their families gone. The Holocaust survivors faced the impossible task of rebuilding lives from ashes. Nations faced hunger, disease, and despair, yet also the hope of renewal. In America, soldiers came home to parades, yet many bore invisible wounds. They had seen too much, lost too much. Families tried to heal. Communities tried to welcome them. But the war had changed them forever. The factories that had once built weapons now turned to peace, shaping a new future. But memories of rationing, sacrifice, and fear would remain for years to come. The Soviet Union, victorious but devastated, mourned millions of dead. Britain, triumphant but exhausted, faced a new dawn with resilience. Across Asia, nations once under occupation began to reclaim their identities, though new struggles soon emerged. The war had ended, but its consequences had only just begun. From the rubble of conflict rose a fragile hope. The United Nations was formed, a pledge by nations to seek peace and cooperation. War crime trials began, holding leaders accountable for atrocities committed in the name of ideology and conquest. The lessons of the war were clear. Unchecked hatred leads to destruction, and silence in the face of evil allows it to grow. For those who lived through it, the memories remain sharp. The sound of planes overhead, the fear of footsteps at night, the sight of friends and family taken away. Yet amid the darkness, there were also memories of courage, of sacrifice, of solidarity. Soldiers who shared rations with strangers, civilians who hid the persecuted, resistance fighters who risked everything for freedom. These stories became the threads of resilience that bound the world together in the aftermath. World War II was more than just battles and strategies. It was the story of humanity at its worst and at its best. It showed the depths of cruelty and the heights of bravery, the fragility of peace and the strength of hope. The war ended with cities in ruins, but also with a determination that such horror should never happen again. And so, as the years passed, those who survived told their stories. They spoke of hardship and endurance, of loss and love, of how ordinary people shaped history in extraordinary times. They reminded the world that freedom is fragile, and that the cost of forgetting the past is too high to bear. The war was over, but its lessons endure. In every memorial, in every faded photograph, in every name carved into stone, the voices of the past still speak. They remind us of the price of hate, the value of courage, and the unbreakable will of the human spirit. The guns of World War II may have gone silent, but its story lives on, etched forever in the memory of humanity.